Coming up next, Book TV presents Afterwards, an hour-long interview program where we invite guest hosts to interview authors. This week, Tom Hayden, founding member of Students for a Democratic Society and former California State Senator, talks about his book, Writings for a Democratic Society. The book collects Mr. Hayden's pieces on various social and political issues that he has engaged in since the early 1960s, from his opposition to the Vietnam War to his more recent work on gang violence. Mr. Hayden is interviewed by John Weiner, professor of history at University of California, Irvine. Professor Weiner's books include Historians in Trouble and Gimme Some Truth, the John Lennon FBI Files. Most recently, he is the editor of Conspiracy in the Streets, the extraordinary trial of the Chicago 8, for which Tom Hayden wrote the foreword.
Tom, you were a writer before you were a political activist. What was your starting point as a writer?
I've always been a writer. One doesn't know where things begin, but I was, I guess I had some need to be heard, and the adults, the teachers, the authorities weren't listening to me or to us. So that would have been a starting point, and I guess I found it easy to learn writing. Who, what, when, where, why. That's the first paragraph that you're taught, the structure of first paragraph in journalism. So I took journalism classes in high school, and we had an underground paper. This is in the 50s. It was
Wow.
it was modeled after Mad Magazine.
Okay.
and we had an overground paper, which was the school paper.
And where in the United States are we in high school?
This is a suburb of Detroit called Royal Oak.
Mm-hmm.
And the big secret, which I didn't learn till a couple of years ago when a graduate student uncovered it, was that the town was among the first suburbs, and it was racially sealed as a white suburb by secret covenant. So I was a writer. I was a sports writer because that was what was available, and I liked sports. And then I became the editor of the paper. And I think also I was a nonconformist. So the nonconformity led me towards critical journalism and also in time towards activism. But if there's something about one's nature, writing would come first for me. Not politics or the rest of it.
And then what changed your mind about the kind of writing you wanted to do? What led you to leave the objective mode of who, what, why, and when, and become the advocate, the pamphleteer, the movement writer?
Well, there was no movement. So with journalism, there were two choices. You wrote editorials, very pompous role, telling everybody what to think. And then you wrote news, which was objective. And obviously, there's more than those two choices, but it took some time for me to realize that. So I started to get interested in interpretive writing, investigative writing. That was less than a commitment to activism, but I started writing about activism. I went to the Bay Area in 1960, and I wrote about the growth of the student movement there, which completely shocked my administration back in Ann Arbor, because they thought that this news would spread like some kind of contagion, which it did, I guess. And then I went to the Democratic Convention here in Los Angeles, and
this is August 1960.
Yeah, and Martin Luther King was marching for a civil rights platform plank. And I went and I interviewed him on the march. And the effect that it had on me was I realized that I was in it for the ambition for the Thomas Hayden byline. And he was in it for much deeper reasons. And I think at that point I began thinking about whether I should stop writing about action but take action. And I had an interesting rationale I thought, which was consistent with being a writer. The theory was that only by taking action sometimes can you create evidence that wasn't there before about whether something's going to happen or not. So keeping yourself out of it was lessening the possibilities of the action taking place with a positive outcome. And so I thought, I'm caught. This is to be on the sidelines, to be objective, is to contribute a little more to the establishment than to the activists. To get involved, I risk losing my critical, objective abilities. So then the question became, well, how can I get involved fully and still retain a certain kind of independence? And I don't think I've moved much beyond that position.
And that was 50 years ago.
40, 50 years ago. Yeah, Jerry Brown once told me the Jesuits had this idea of contemplation in action, that was their discipline. That comes close to it. Sociologists would call it participatory
Observation, participant observer.
being a participant observer. I guess you could call it participatory writing for a participatory society. But it's not easy to resolve, and I noticed that in this book of writings, going back over 50 years up till now, till Iraq, I tend to be more comfortable being a narrator, but my experience in social movements, I feel, gives me an invaluable edge over observers, historians, newspaper reporters, because I've been there, I am there, I've done that, I know what that feels like. And so I have a better ability to evaluate what's going to happen, I think, than somebody who has only observed. But it's a marginal difference.
Now, you're best known in this, let's call it early period, for the Port Huron Statement, which was kind of the defining document of the student movement, the New Left in the United States. But even before the Port Huron Statement, you were sort of becoming a more engaged writer.
Right.
How did that happen? And I know the book has some examples of these pre-Port Huron political writing.
I was sent by Students for Democratic Society to the South for $50 a week. I lived in Georgia. I was in love, and she was a civil rights worker for the YWCA out of Austin, and she too was a writer and a poet, and so I think I saw my task as a Tom Paine kind of pamphleteer. I will observe people fighting for their lives, risking their lives in the worst parts of Mississippi, and then I'll publish the pamphlet and I'll tour northern cities and campuses and I'll speak about what I've seen. So it was a pamphleteer phase.
And your book, The Tom Hayden Reader, has some examples of your writing from those early days. I wonder if you could if you could read us a sample.
Yeah, I think Port Huron is more famous, and I might read you the first sentence of Port Huron to give you this. No, there's this strange sense of how unorthodox I was as an advocate. They wanted me to stir it up a little bit, but my first sentence was, "We are people of this generation, bred in at least modest comfort, housed now in universities, looking uncomfortably to the world we inherit." Not exactly the Communist Manifesto. But it's but you can see that's kind of a distant writing, but people seem to think that it did speak for them. Now, the youthful idealism, I wrote something in Mississippi in '61 that was called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Action. It was about a killing and some demonstrations, but the subtitle, Dignity for the Enslaved and for Us All. So you can see this robust, romantic thing. But earlier, in '61, I wrote a preliminary for the Port Huron statement, and I can't tell if it's sophomoric or it's not embarrassing, but it's
Let's go for it.
it's a young person's writing. What is desperately needed, I think, is the person of vision and clarity who sees both the model society and the pitfalls that precede its attainment, and who will not destroy his vision for short-run gains, but instead hold it out for all to see as the furthest dream and perimeter of human possibility.
Vision and clarity. Sounds great to me.
That's right. And there's one other part of this that I thought was noteworthy in terms of how these movements developed, because they were so different than the movements that were built around isms, great faith, and so on. I am beset by doubt at this point. So perhaps are we all. We doubt our ability to effect change. We doubt our ability to understand enough. We doubt the validity of time-honored liberal notions. We doubt the right and wrong of it. And I don't recommend that we banish doubt. Not that where there's a will, there's a way, but I would suggest that it is possible and necessary to think and act provisionally yet strongly in the midst of our doubts. We must begin to see doubt not as a reason for inaction, but as a reminder of our fallibility.
Fantastic.
I think there's some Catholic
good.
influence here.
I think it's good. So thank you very much for that reading. The Port Huron Statement, 1962 it was published, is that right?
It was drafted at the end of '61. It was circulated in the spring of '62, and it was published by mimeographed means for 25 cents a copy, I think in June '62. This would be before Kennedy was assassinated.
Yeah.
Before civil rights had become quite mainstream, before the March on Washington, before the Betty Friedan book about women's liberation. It was still a period that I think of, and anybody that went through it, as a period of that beautiful innocence that James Joyce wrote about in The Portrait of the Artist. It's really, you can't understand the 60s without understanding this brief utopian moment.
Well, I want to ask you more about that moment, because the Port Huron Statement has turned out to be an incredibly important historical document. If there is a manifesto of the student movement of the first part of the 60s, that's it. It was, and I remember when it came out, it was just incredibly eloquent and a visionary call on students to move away from apathy and doubt towards participatory democracy, you called it. This is the writing of a very young person. How were you able to write something so eloquent and so visionary at such a young age?
Well, I think that you write differently when you're young, when you're middle-aged and more experienced, when you're old and you're looking back. And I don't rank them as more or less important, but yeah, this is the writing of an inspired group of people like myself, and it came from a combination of what we had seen in terms of the apathy all around us and the utter apathy of the suburbs from which we came, versus the bravery and courage of young people our age, nearly all of them black, in the South, who were standing up and doing something about their oppression. And I think it takes that friction, you know, between your surface reality and what's starting to happen. It sparks a creativity, and if it rang true to people, I think it's because it was simply a cycling back to the audience what they already knew or were coming to know because they were starting to awaken. It wasn't a foreign set of ideas dropped on them to learn in study groups or something like that.
And how important was it that this was a statement of a group, not just of one writer?
The value of having one person, principal author, is you get a certain consistency of tone and style.
Yes, which it definitely had.
And then the value of a group is that you get much more buy-in and participation and a sense of ownership, that this is about us. We created this vision. The downside of that is it can become more clunky as things are added. I'll tell you a funny example that didn't really harm it. I had written in the section on the economy that I think it was all couched as we, were supportive of small innovative businesses, community businesses. And then my draft would go to a group that sat around in the grass and read and argued and kind of rewrote it, not stylistically, but as if it was a constitutional proposal with amendments, right? And so Rob Burlage, who's still active in healthcare in New York City and was then the editor of the student paper in Austin, Texas. Many of us were campus editors. He brought back his group's revisions of the economic section and said, the amendment number 1 is an amendment by Brother Karl Marx to Brother Tom Hayden's draft on the economy. And I forget, it really didn't go beyond, kind of watered down democratic socialism, public ownership of key assets of the economy, but it eliminated the reference to small business.
Very good.
So you gain, you lose when you collectivize the writing effort.
Now, the Port Huron statement didn't just come out of a political moment, it also came out of a world of writing other articles, other authors. You were also an intellectual as well as an activist. Who were the intellectuals who were on your mind?
That's a good question. The 60s are remembered very much through our projections and not in their totality. The example I have in mind is that it was an inspiring moment in religion, particularly the opening in the Catholic Church, Pacem in Terris, the coming of a Catholic president for the first time in the United States, and the civil rights movement in the South was largely a church-based movement with heavy Jewish support from the North. And the most lasting impact was called liberation theology, which was growing through community organizing in base communities among the peasantry in Latin America and Central America. It was a very powerful movement, and for a time it became the majority movement in the Catholic Church, officially sanctioned in 1968 as a matter of fact. And the Port Huron statement has to be located there. There's a spirituality to the Port Huron statement. There's a sense of values. There's language that's very reminiscent of these early Catholic teachings, the linkage between liberation in the here and now, as well as in the larger scheme of eternity. And I don't remember the sequence, but I think Port Huron came first. But there was a woman named Mary Varela who became a Latina organizer around health issues and still is in northern New Mexico. She was very influential, but at the time she was with the Young Catholic Worker, I think that was the name of it, and she had some of the writings of the church in her pocket or her purse that she carried around with her. And people were seen in small groups comparing, the language, because we had to make a decision on what we thought was human nature itself.
big questions.
Yeah, you don't want to leave that out of a manifesto. And we thought that the view of Niebuhr and some of the darker views of human nature led into a sort of political economy that was based on fencing people in, and to the Federalist Papers' notion of containing the egos and preventing selfish interests from arising. And we thought that was counterposed to liberation, which meant the audacity of hope, shall we say.
Good phrase.
And we were on that side of that argument, although, of course, throughout it all, I remained doubtful of all the basics. But there was some, by osmosis or other means, there was some linkage between the stirrings at Port Huron in that statement and what was going on in other parts of the world, and what was going on in religious institutions that is usually forgotten.
Fascinating. Well, the next big chapter in the work of Tom Hayden as an author is your writings about Newark. Newark, you had gone to Newark to do community organizing, part of the SDS strategy. Newark, as they say, exploded in 1967.
Right.
Massive, unimaginable uprising. You were in the middle of all that, and the New York Review asked you to write about it. This was a 90,000-word piece, which was published in the New York Review with a very exciting cover. I think it's the longest piece the New York Review has ever published in its 50-year history. How did this come to be, and what was that piece like?
My reflection is that, well, my writing may have changed in terms of mellowing or deepening over 50 years, but it's pretty much the same. And it becomes well-known writing, or it finds a mass outlet only if that's useful to the editors of publications who are the arbiters of what's politically correct or culturally interesting. So in 1967, the New York Times chose to write a column about me that said, Thomas Emmett Hayden, pragmatic radical. Very promising young man, I guess that meant.
Okay.
And so I became kind of like an icon of the New Left, because all phenomenon have to have two things, a founding manifesto and a leader. We didn't think so, but that wasn't up to us. It's like the same media establishment named the Beat Generation the Beat Generation. They named the hippies, and so on. So I was named. And then it happened that I was right in the center of this Newark rebellion and violence, and 26 people killed, hundreds injured, and I was one of the only people who was, again, recording the whole thing. I was right there. I saw people shot. I talked immediately.
You'd already been there for years, so you
I'd been knocking on doors. I knew people.
Hugh Adonisio is a name I remember.
That's right, and I had access, therefore, to the lower depths of the ghetto. Where most of the events took place. And so I was a source. A grand jury subpoenaed me, they threatened me, they tried to take my notes. And I don't remember how it went, but I had a meeting in the middle of the night with the governor of New Jersey and the leader of the Corps chapter, Bob Curvin, and we argued and negotiated to get the troops to leave, much like Vietnam. And they did leave in the morning, partial withdrawal. But for whatever reason, I got noticed, and I got asked by the New York Review to write a piece. And I sat on a rooftop in New York, and I just chopped it out, a theory of how it happened and who died and so on. No snipers, utterly predictable. And they published the whole thing. And Andy Kopkind, who I think he was an editor of something at the time, sat with me, and he asked me how Molotov cocktails are made. And I drew one on a napkin, and he took it to the editors, and they drew this bomb, a Molotov cocktail, and they put it on the cover of this magazine. So it was a sensational.
With your name under it.
Well, there was
Tom
the
Hayden.
Rebellion in Newark by Tom Hayden, and then Random House published the whole thing as a paperback book immediately. And it was not that my writing was any better or any worse. It was at that moment I was the man. I've noticed this over 50 years, where you go like this and then you'll rise and fall and wonder what's happening. And a lot of it, I think, is out of our hands. It doesn't have anything to do with the quality of your work.
So what happened with that piece?
Oh, it's been used in special forces training academies for the U.S. Army, riot control. Who knows? It's never been republished. You can get it online.
And yet
But it's a standard work in the history of urban insurrections, which we've had many of in the past century, after World War I, World War II, the 60s. And it was just an attempt to make sense of why these things happen and to argue against the notion that they're unpredictable, chaotic mob violence with no discernible pattern, no logic to it. We wanted to say, yeah, there's a logic to this, because we wanted to get it over with. We wanted the troops to leave, and we had to predict to the officials that the violence would go down, that it had come to a point where it was only the occupation by the military that was causing the violent reaction from the youth. And if you removed the military, the community it was exhausted. They wanted to heal. They had to go back to work. They were losing their jobs. They were being thrown out of school. So the book was an attempt to make sense of what most people prefer to believe is like senseless rioting.
90,000 word piece on the cover of the New York Review books, and yet you did not become a New York Review regular.
I was an activist. I was a leader of anti-war and student struggles. I didn't think of myself as wanting to be a New York Review regular. I was pleased, and still am pleased, that there was space for this eyewitness account. It wasn't my writing necessarily, it was that I was the eyewitness. There was no other documentation like this. I was there, I was an organizer there, and I had the information on how these 20 or 25 people were killed. But I didn't get any subsequent offers. If anything, I was, I don't want to sound self-pitying, I was shunned by the New York Review. And I think it's simply because certain people came to believe that the New Left had become too radical, too far out, too sympathetic to violence, and shouldn't be encouraged. It wasn't me that put a Molotov cocktail on the cover. Right. I think they were having a flirtation with violence.
Yes.
I knew very well what violence was about. I had seen it firsthand, and but I think I've always had that trouble. There's not a lot of space in American writing for people who attempt to explain violence.
Well, we need to talk about your writings about Vietnam and the Chicago conspiracy trial, but first we need to take a short break.
Afterwards and several other C-SPAN programs are available for download as podcast. Visit booktv.org. More with Tom Hayden and John Weiner in a moment.
Retirement deficits are approaching $1 trillion. Former Wall Street Journal columnist Roger Lowenstein argues that pension concessions, like those offered in the past by General Motors and the New York City transit system, are the cause. He looks at our current financial future and presents steps to secure the retirement of workers in While America Aged. While America Aged, Sunday at 5:15 p.m. on C-SPAN 2's Book TV.
Afterwards, with Tom Hayden and John Weiner, continues.
When we think of the 60s, of course, we think of Vietnam. You were one of the key leaders of the anti-war movement. You went to Vietnam at the height of the American bombing, and you wrote about that, too. Let's talk about that.
Well, that's another example where the trip to Hanoi was an act of civil disobedience. It was technically in violation of the State Department's laws and regulations. and there was a challenge on the table, and the government chose not to try to indict us or imprison us. And in addition to it being an act, it was an attempt to break through a barrier, because there had been no coverage of Vietnam. Nobody knew who the enemy was. Nobody knew North from South, Viet Cong from Mao Zedong. And so my purpose was to write. I went with a member of the American Communist Party, Herbert Apteker, because he was able to make an arrangement with the North Vietnamese Communist Party, and with my friend from Civil Rights Days, Professor Stoughton Lind, a Quaker, whose parents were sociologists and American historians. So Stoughton and I wrote a book attempting to describe what we called the other side. And as I look at it, it seems to me overly romanticized. But the purpose, I think, was the same, to bring people in this country in connection with the other, we have others who are always excluded from the mainstream politics and culture, as if they can be handled by napalming them or erasing them or keeping us ignorant of them, as opposed to dialogue. So that was the idea, and I never would have thought that 10 years of my life would be spent knowing Vietnam. I had some kind of fatigue, because I just went back to Vietnam for the first time in 32 years.
Wow.
I brought my little boy, I brought my wife, and I was in pursuit of what I called the old revolutionaries. I met several people who are all in their 80s, who I had met first in 1965, just to see how they were doing and how life had changed. You know, it's a country that's at peace for the first time ever. Diplomatic relations with the U.S., World Trade Organization members, proud to have foreign investment, and the average person is about 16 or 18 years old. So they're interested in the same gadgets and technology that our kids are, and the old revolutionaries have the same problem of trying to get the kids to remember the past and dwell on it a little bit and learn lessons from it. And it's a very young country. It's shocking. One of the things I think I've learned is that while you can write accurately and authentically and movingly, I'm not sure that I or many people who attempt it are successful with their powers of prediction. Do you know what I mean?
Yes.
Nothing ever turns out the way that you thought it was going to. Not Vietnam, not life.
So the next chapter of your life is Chicago '68, the Democratic National Convention. You're one of the key organizers of anti-war demonstrations. Nixon gets elected in November. You are indicted at the as soon as Nixon takes office. One of the first things they do is indict you and your fellow organizers. The trial takes up a big part of your life and a big part of the American media.
5 years, that's right.
But as I understand it, you didn't write about the trial at that point. As far as I can tell, at least from the Tom Hayden Reader, it wasn't really until you wrote your memoir, Reunion, that you really take on the whole issue of the trial and what the trial was.
No,
Is that right?
At the time I wrote dispatches for I think a defunct left-wing paper in New York, the National Guardian. We had a few underground papers, that was it. Not much alternative radio. And I did writing. Again, at the trial, I had the same schizophrenic experience of being a defendant, an activist, anti-war, and I was serving as basically the third lawyer. I was constantly interviewing witnesses and preparing the defense and trying to analyze how were we going to persuade the jury, and if that failed, how were we going to lay the foundation for an appeal? How were we going to succeed in what seemed to be a very rigged judicial system? So
you were busy.
I was busy, but the writing was actually, it may be lost. I don't know where I couldn't find it, but I did a lot of writing on the run. And then I did some writing looking back, of course. And it's become extremely important to get that record straight because, as you know, we're in the 40th anniversary of this event. And soon we'll be in the 50th anniversary of everything that happened in the 60s. And there's a fight going on. You know, was it worth the battle? Should the legacy be preserved? Was it all about nothing? Or will some of us be remembered so that others are forgotten? The approaches to memory are not outside of the field of contestation, let's say. So I think it's important we keep engaged in the 50th anniversary of the 60s. So that we can die a natural death. Many people have tried to kill us before.
Yes.
The 60s have been pronounced dead, but it's there. It's quite alive in the presidential campaign. It's alive everywhere. So keeping some faith with what happened and telling the stories is just as important as it was getting people to register to vote, it seems to me. If their story isn't told, they're still voiceless.
So, next chapter. Vietnam War ends in 1975. The movement is in complete collapse at this point. Your old comrades go their different ways. It's a question of sort of what's going to happen now. Cherry Rubin famously becomes a yuppie. Abby Hoffman eventually gets indicted for selling cocaine. You made the decision. Rennie Davis hooks up with an Indian religious figure. You made a different decision, which was to run for office in the Democratic Party in California, to join the system, as we called it then. This is a huge turning point in your own political life, and it also turns out in your writing. How did you decide to take that turn?
Well, everything gets characterized and simplified a little bit. I mean, Abby Hoffman and Jerry Rubin and Rennie Davis were more than those reductionist descriptions. There was Dave Dellinger, who remained a lifetime pacifist, very active. John Freunds is a public health specialist at UCLA. Bill Kunstler lived on to fight many courtroom battles. Len Weinglass remains one of my great friends today. Lee Weiner works in public relations for progressive causes. And I was, I guess, tagged as having entered the system, right? And I never thought of that that way. I thought of it as it was the 60s were over. We had won the big battles, and that's why there was so much confusion. The war was over. The draft had been eliminated, and so on. And I wanted to know how far you could take the citizen action and social movement perspective into the institutions before you were stopped. Was it true that you would sell out or not? Because we'd never been given the opportunity and been banging on these doors, and it would seem a little ridiculous if the doors opened and you said, I never wanted to enter this place ever anyway. So I thought of it as an experiment. Unfortunately, perhaps, it lasted 18 years. I was in office for a long time. And I think that this was the sort of the responsible, quote-unquote, period of my life where I had a gavel, right? I was chairing committees all the time. I had public policy responsibilities. And my writing became a little more legalistic and a little more advocacy writing, with a lot of pieces published in the LA Times as op-eds on genetically engineered food, or the Orange County financial scandal, or the saving the salmon from extinction because of pesticide use and overfishing, the higher education becoming a racket, so expensive that students were being forced out financially, all these issues. So the writing was tight, it was programmatic. Here's the problem, here's the solution. And it was another time when I was in demand, so to speak, in the marketplace. I could get op-ed pieces published all the time. I never would have imagined that I would be in office for 18 years, but I was, till 2000. Some would say the best years of your life. And the experiment was left inconclusive.
Well, you accomplished a lot, and you also wrote a lot. You got involved with gangs and thinking about gang violence at this time.
That was the outer perimeter of the possible. Remember the early essay. I would say that I had to sacrifice attention to some controversial issues because there didn't seem to be any. It wasn't that I was selling out so much as there wasn't any traction or leverage there. So I chose not to take up the war on drugs, for example, which I think is an expensive, counterproductive wedge issue that I should have taken up. But because there was no easy legislative solution, I couldn't get a bill out of committee, I let that slide. The exception, and I'm not quite sure the explanation of it, I think it has to do with my roots in Newark, in the South, was I couldn't abide the demonizing of all young people as gang members, all gang members as murderers or potential murderers, suitable only for imprisonment, that led to California being the largest incarceration center in the United States, and the United States having 20 or 30% of the world's inmates. Amazing. The politics of law and order were so successful politically that we were creating these huge side effects that will be with us. So I tried a lot of zany things. I hired some ex-gang members on my staff. I tried to analyze programs that might help transform these young people into positive and constructive rebels, if they were going to be rebels, as opposed to self-destructive. And I think we had some success. I think we actually changed some minds on the inside. But everybody thought I was out of my mind politically, that they did not want to be tagged as soft on gangs or using tax dollars to hire ex-gang members. Even if they agreed privately, it was for a worthy purpose. So there I saw the limits of working within the system. Good people, but calculating about what they had to do to survive and excluding certain issues altogether as somebody's business down the road, but not the kind of issues they wanted to take up. Which meant if you didn't have outside forces, external crises, you might never get the attention of politicians. You had to make it something that their constituencies cared deeply about to get them activated.
You wrote a book about gangs, and then you also got involved with Ireland, another place with a history of violence, conflict,
all makes sense, doesn't
warfare. Your Ireland book is one of my favorites.
Well, I got very interested in Ireland because in the late 60s, after Chicago, I felt like I'd had a lot of my American identity beaten out of me. And I had never been raised as an Irish American. I was a white young man from the Midwest. And as the identity got taken away, the women took their identity, the blacks took their identity, the Chicanos took theirs, what was left was being a white man.
Yeah.
Which...
pretty boring.
Yeah, it's not promising. And so at just that moment, I saw on television the civil rights marchers in Northern Ireland being hosed, gassed, and arrested, and they were singing "We Shall Overcome," and it had a stunning effect on me. And not a born-again experience, but stunning because I realized that this was a missing part of my heritage, and that they knew more about ourselves than I knew about them. They were even borrowing and embracing and universalizing the song "We Shall Overcome." So I became very, very interested. I didn't think that my identity had been lost and I could just call up Lost and Found and get it back. I thought it was more likely that it was stolen in a subtle way, gradually, by my parents trying to blend in, the universities discrediting any idea of Irish civilization. And I searched, and I tried to go to Ireland, and I was prevented from going there because I was seen as a revolutionary from America. So it took me a long time. But then I became very interested in the beginnings of the peace process, and I renewed my old contacts from Ireland. And for about 10 years, I led an additional life besides the legislature and family life. I was constantly involved in trying to persuade the Clinton administration to do the right thing in Northern Ireland, and constantly involved in trying to work to promote greater understanding of how there might be a peace deal that could be negotiated and once and for all move the island forward. And these were very, very important years. I felt I was having useful effects, but it was also quite important for the reconstitution of who I was. And I wrote a couple of books on the Irish famine of the 1840s, and another one called Irish on the Inside. It didn't get me anywhere in California politics. I should have lived in Boston,
Yes.
New York, Chicago, or San Francisco, but in West LA, people were just like wondering,
What's with this guy?
yeah, Tom, focus, that sort of thing.
So eventually you were termed out of the legislature. You didn't get to be the mayor of LA. 1999, you're no longer a elected Democratic Party official. There's some anti-globalization protests.
No, I
in
actually
Seattle.
was. I was out in 2000, but
Oh, you were still an elected
yeah, the
official
point
in
is,
'99? Wow.
some of my young friends, the children of the '60s generation, came to me and said, "Tom, Seattle, you've
And
got to go."
And what did this mean to you?
Well, I gradually tried to incorporate what it meant to me as a legislator, and then later in terms of social movements. What it meant as a legislator is that the World Trade Organization protocols took away from California sovereignty over a lot of legislative policy in agriculture, in pesticides, in environmentalism. Anything that was considered a restraint on free corporate trade could be challenged. And I commissioned a study, and we found there were 100 California laws, some of which I had been very involved in, that would be on the block if we accepted this arrangement and these tribunals. So I went up to
Yes, and
to
yes.
Seattle, and I was tear gassed. I had no sense of the creative militancy of this new generation of students. I'd seen them percolating up, yes, in the environmental movement, but this was really an extraordinary wave of demonstrations that actually stopped. They wanted to end, but they stopped the World Trade Organization in its tracks and caused a continuing reconsideration of what we're doing that is still reflected in today's presidential debates.
Now I remember
It was very effective.
I remember interviewing you on the radio right after those demonstrations, and you were arguing at that point, these demonstrations are better than anything we did in the '60s.
I think what I said is they were bigger than Chicago,
Yeah.
and that they had more immediate effect in the sense that they actually stopped the World Trade Organization temporarily, but they stopped it from functioning, stopped it from approving all of these onerous regulations. When we tried to stop segregated lunch counters 30 years before, we did, but then they would reopen, and it would be a long, long process. But in this case, I thought, when the dust cleared and the smoke settled and the tear gas was gone, people would look at it more clearly and see that a more secretive apparatus, the WTO, had been exposed, and we had bought precious time for the American people and American institutions to consider what is our role in the world. You know, are we trying to create a corporate empire? Are we trying to roll back protections on health, safety, environment, consumer products that were the achievements of past generations? And I think it was very healthy. The Seattle generation, I'm afraid, became derailed somewhat because of Iraq. So we won't know what the Seattle generation would have become. For that brief period, though, it was extremely powerful. It was global, and it's still around. But until Iraq is really resolved, I don't think you'll find enough attention here. The evidence that it goes on is, look at Latin America, 8, 9, 10 elections to the presidency in countries that used to be under dictatorships, that were considered economic satellites of the United States, whether it's Argentina, Brazil, Venezuela, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, the list goes on. These are all countries that have turned against what was transpiring in Seattle. So it's by no means over, and I went to many of these places. I went to the demonstrations in Miami, I went to Cancun, to the next effort at the WTO, I went to Bolivia on a couple of occasions to investigate the rise of a peasant movement and the election of the first indigenous president of that country. All very moving and interesting experiences that reminded me of Mississippi in the beginning. But now the South was the whole global South, and it seemed to me a certain consistent pattern from the beginning to the end of my life, at least my life so far.
Your life so far, for the last 5 years, you've been very engaged with the Iraq War, critiquing the Iraq War, organizing against the Iraq War, and writing about the Iraq War.
I have.
What do you see as the key issues in your writing in this period?
Well, I think I can be helpful because of my Vietnam experience. That's why I chose it. It reminds me of the days during Vietnam when there were moderates who said, we can't just leave. There's got to be negotiations now. And then there were people who said, no negotiations, just get out. And because no one could resolve the disagreements here, the whole business collapsed horrifically, and Americans were leaving on helicopters, and genocide was being committed in Cambodia, and so on. So I do think a lot of attention has to be paid to the reason why our government won't leave, and more attention to what does it take for them to be compelled to leave. I happen to think the election of a new president is a step, but not the only step, because this president wants to continue and to send it on to the future. The key finding is that the presidents, the congressional people, the powers that be, see themselves as a superpower, as an empire, as number one. And like Machiavelli, the reputation of the government, the reputation of the Pentagon is all important. So they simply are unable to consider getting out. A businessman, on the other hand, he might very well say, what's wrong with cutting our losses?
Yeah.
Like, they're used to like leaving chaos behind and starting a new enterprise. But those who represent the United States of America with capital letters think that they're representing our supremacy, and so you have to find some way to protect their image to the extent possible while getting them out. And I think the will of the people as expressed in voting is an absolute essential, but it's very revealing that it doesn't seem to be enough.
Well, let's talk about that a little more. Both Democratic candidates say they want to draw down troops rapidly. They sort of disagree on how many, how soon. What's your assessment of what more you would like to see?
Well, the difference between the Republicans and Democrats seems clear, but as many taxi drivers have told me, you should always vote for the guy that sounds like he's against you, because he'll turn out to be for you. So you never know really what's going on here, but there seems to be this sharp difference. Keep the war going, end the war.
Yeah.
But in those three little words, end the war, you find Hillary Clinton most of all, Barack Obama somewhat, has a qualifier that there has to be a residual force for counterterrorism, for training Iraqis, for embedding themselves with Iraqis, for advising Iraqis, protecting the embassy, and so on. And if you total it up, you're talking between 10 and 30,000. If you understand that there's a 3-to-1 multiplier in terms of the backup troops you need to support those troops, you are at 50,000 minimum. And it begins to look like counterinsurgency in Central America, not an exit from Iraq. Whether this is election hyperbole, whether this is reality, remains to be seen. But you know, my experience is that civil society and public opinion and voters count, if only because the politicians have to come around every 4 years and they have to seek our votes. And having a mandate for peace this November, just as there was a mandate for peace in November 2006, is a very important contribution that we can make. The rest is to find ways to compel them to get out sooner rather than later. My worst estimate is that it will be with us another 5 or 8 years. And I say that because Dan Ellsberg wrote from his experience in the Pentagon and with the Pentagon Papers that the purpose of the executive branch of the establishment is not to lose. And so they will escalate enough to not lose and pass the poison pill of the war on to the next administration, who will learn that they dare not lose, and who therefore will do whatever it takes to keep it going, to pass it on again. There has to be an adult alternative, I would say, but I don't know who in our establishment has the wisdom to see that this actually is a threat to our democracy and our standing in the world, and it's better to seize the diplomatic initiative, bargain with Iran, talk to the neighboring countries, but you're not going to get anywhere unless you announce that you actually plan to leave, you're going to abandon the occupation. The UN isn't even going to support the occupation after December. Our allies have virtually all left. The British, I think, have 1,500 outside an air base. There's no there, and yet the image of something there is what the president is trying to promote. And you'll notice the Democrats are vague. Obama's clearest, 16-month withdrawal of combat troops. But his advisors say leave 30,000 behind. Well, that's up to Iraq. My question, from a military point of view, would be, how would you do better with 30,000 Americans there if you failed to win with 150,000? These are questions to take up next year.
Well, Tom, I'm sorry we're out of time. Thanks for talking with us today.
Thanks, John. Always.